Welcome everyone. I'm Jabril Ben-Sedrin, the host of this webinar on behalf of CESA Systems. Today, I'm pleased to host once again Daniel Rodriguez, who is a lean consultant and auditor for a number of companies. Earlier in his career, he was the America's lead for operational excellence in a $20 billion technology company. Today, he shares with us more than 15 years of experience in finance, operations, and supply chain, and of course, lean. We will have time for Q&A, so please feel free to write your questions during the presentation, and I will read them to Daniel after his last slide. Thank you, Daniel, for being with us again. The floor is yours.
Today's topic is 5S, beyond the shop floor. As I think all of us are aware, in the webinar, 5S is an effective tool. It's a simple but effective tool that allows us to expand our operations. And I hope that by the end of this webinar, you see that 5S is not just something used on the shop floor in a manufacturing setting. But with that said, I did a little research on, did a little research on trying to find the origins of the assembly line. And the furthest back I was able to find was something regarding the first quote-unquote assembly line. I'm sure there's probably something older, but this was the oldest I was able to dig up with my research, where it talked about the Venetian arsenal. And basically, the Venetian arsenal was building ships, galleys to be exact, which is pictured on the bottom right. The interesting thing of the Venetian arsenal is that they were so proud of their manufacturing prowess that during a 1574 visit from King Henry of France, he came on to Venice for a 2-hour banquet. And in the 2 hours he was there, the arsenal actually built him a ship. So this was one of the oldest. If you can imagine a large assembly line, if you look at the bottom left, that is actually a map of the process flow and material flow throughout Venice that the Venetian arsenal used to build ships. I just found it very interesting, and this picture dates back to 1797. So as we look at our lean journeys, it was interesting to find that before Kaizens, before TPS, that the idea of efficiency in manufacturing has always been ever present throughout history. To fast forward a bit, now more to the origins of the 5S methodology that we are probably all aware of, or more commonly known as 5S within the TPS confines. 5S started with, it's credited with beginning with Takichi Toyota, his son, and a engineer from Toyota named Ono, who took visits to Ford in the US and noticed an assembly line that was producing high volumes but was very wasteful, and also a visit to the Piggly Wiggly, which if anyone's familiar with, it's a supermarket chain, or was a supermarket chain. I don't know if they're still in existence now, actually. But what they noticed at the Piggly Wiggly was that they had a very efficient manner of stocking shelves. So as product was pulled off of shelves, there was a product immediately placed on using a partial card system, which Ono refers to as that was one of his key inspirations for creating the Kanban system as well. So interestingly enough, we have the Japanese and the English terms, Siri, Saitan, Saiso, Shiketsu, and Shitsuke, which translate into what we know as the sword, set, and order, shine, standardize, and sustain. So that brings us up to the more modern TPS terminology that we're all familiar with. And given the experience level of this group, I don't think we need to go into too much more detail, but what I did want to share with the group was just basically elements of successful implementations that I've noticed in manufacturing settings. So we talk about training and Kaizen events, which kind of go hand in hand. Obviously, there's employee management training. I think we're all aware of those wonderfully, occasionally staged quick win photos, the before and after pictures, which it seems we can have a good time with, but they are extremely effective in delivering the message and kind of charting out progress to see where we were versus where we are, and then where we want to be. The second theme, obviously, is an auditing program, standardized auditor training. Of course, the nature of auditing is there's always some subjectability based on the auditor himself, but the higher quality the standardized auditor program and the training, the more consistent the results. And then, of course, you have sustainability and accountability, and the introduction of Gemba. What I've seen is that the completion of 5S really becomes sustainable once you introduce Gemba into the either the work cells or the department or the facility. It helps in that shift from this is a one-time project, spring cleaning type of initiative to this is the way we do things and this is how we operate moving forward. So again, these are just some elements of successful 5S. Excuse me, the interesting part of 5S is that while it's simple, the implementation can be can vary and have extremely varied results as well. I'm sure we have quite a few success stories. You probably have one or two stories that did not go so well, but these are the elements that I found. These are the common elements in these successful implementations. With that said, excuse me one sec. If you can take 5 or 10 seconds, there should be a poll question in front of you on your screens, excuse me. We would just like to gauge quickly with these 3 questions regarding sustainability of 5S, 5S within the organization and improvements, and obviously formal training. So if you can take a few seconds to just fill that out, greatly appreciate it.
So you should be seeing a poll on your screen right now. And so far, we are at 50, more or less 50, 56% for score number 3 and 25% score number 2, with an 11% 4 and 3% 5. So overall, somewhere towards the middle. That's for how sustainable is your program.
So for the most part, they seem sustainable, if I understood that correctly.
It's for the most part, yes, average. Right, average to low.
Average, wow, that's interesting.
The second question is, can 5S in your organization be improved, which I guess is partly related. So you should be seeing that second question on your screen.
Yeah, the sustainability is the hard part, as I think we're all aware. It's difficult, and a lot of that goes to how you build it. It's not to say that if it's not sustainable, it was poorly executed, because that's not the case. But what I have noticed in the longer, let's say slightly, we have this obsession with quickly turning things around, which is good for the short term, but the longer, more successful, sustainable implementations take a little more time bringing people along, and that seems to be one of the differences that I've noticed. But yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah, makes sense. The question: how much room for improvement in your 5S program? 5%, much room for improvement. I mean, 39%. So we have at 80% more or less consider that it's a score of 4 or 5. So pretty much a lot of room for improvement in 5S programs.
Absolutely.
And the final question. Yeah, sorry, I'll launch the final questions once you and let you continue.
No, and being in the business of continuous improvement, we at times forget that we are part of that loop. right? We bring the knowledge, we train, we implement, and then we, even as practitioners at times, think, okay, my work here is complete. I gave them the knowledge, the system, and the know-how, and now it should run itself. And even as practitioners ourselves, it's always good to go back and kind of keep touch base and make sure that things are running as intended to ensure that the organization continues in the best possible way. I am curious of the third question now, actually, given the responses of the first two.
Right. So they're towards the lower scores, low to little and average training. It's really 90% are low to average training. And we have 8% who have very complete training.
That actually is in line with my expectations. It seems, again, when the idea is to implement a change, it's about the execution, which there's a fine balance between understanding the knowledge and the skill set and then implementing and executing. We tend to fast forward to the execution and kind of pick things up along the way, which is not necessarily to say it doesn't yield results. But again, for the long-term sustainability, the training becomes critical. I actually would not have my practice if I wasn't trained and if I didn't have the privilege of seeing multiple business units and multiple facilities and across industry. Those lenses, the sharpening of that lens and giving me some of those formal experiences is really, really valuable. So perfect. That's very, very good to know. Given the growth and the success of 5S in the manufacturing areas, we now start to see or have seen for the last decade or so an approach to 5S in non-manufacturing areas. So what does that mean? Office space utilization or admin areas, right? Consumables management, where we touch on storage utilization. I wish I could tell you that that was not a picture of an office that I used to work in on the left, but that's actually a picture of an office I used to work in on the left many a moon ago. And that just becomes the standard bearer. You see it every day and you kind of just, it's assumed that's what's going on. A lot of the key improvements also in the electronic and physical data storage and file storage, right? I imagine, without showing a raise of hands, there is either our desktop looks like that or once looked like that. So when you talk about finding things and being able to access critical files, editing rights and documentation controls, all of that comes into play. So if your desktop is not properly supported, you could be saving some of your most critical documents in a manner that is not backed up. And of course, then we talk about the IT infrastructure. We go through the hardware, cable management, power management, hardware management, and that really, what I've noticed on the IT side, what I've noticed on the IT side is that there's a general approach to ordering multiple items in excess simply because they're cheap. So a keyboard, a mouse, I'm sure some of your organizations, you walk into a closet, you have 10 nice, the electronic kinds, and there's really no home for them, but it's something that they order because it's better to have it than to not go without it, and they're perceived to be cheap goods. So that's there's been a big push on the IT management in the non-manufacturing areas as well. So again, some of the elements of successful implementations in non-manufacturing settings, of course, is eerily similar, but a bit different. Here, the emphasis on training is even more critical. And I say that because in a production area or manufacturing area, there's generally the visibility of the area leads you to want to be more organized. You cannot work if your aisles are blocked, if your tools are gone, or if you are in a position where there's just a total disarray going on the shop floor. In the administrative side, it's a lot more difficult to see those things. I can't see everyone's desktop. I can't see every closet in the building from one vantage point. So the training becomes that much more critical, especially if you are, there's a safety component, I would say, that's prevalent on the manufacturing side that's not necessarily prevalent on the admin side. Unorganized workspace could lead to injury and EHS reporting, but unorganized desktop just, sadly, but it just affects me. So if I'm wasting my time, then that's not that big a deal, or the perception is it's not that big a deal, which is actually not true at all. Of course, we have the before and after, which those are a little just as fun on the non-manufacturing side. Of course, the auditing programs, again, critical. I would say just as critical as in the manufacturing side in order to keep some consistency, especially because these tend to be behaviors that are maybe not as intuitive to everyone within the non-manufacturing space. And of course, then sustainability and accountability. I've gotten some pushback on this point previously, but there hasn't been one successful implementation that doesn't introduce Gemba. Now, this is a very, let's say, a much friendlier looking Gemba board than a lot that I've seen and had been a part of with some of the implementations. But even in, that's one area where you get the most resistance. It's why am I putting up a Gemba board in my office or in an office, in our area, in our department? And that becomes a bit of a sore point, but that also becomes the sustainability and accountability portion. Introducing the non-manufacturing areas to Gemba is just as critical, if not more critical, because they're not used to being measured in a lot of those ways. So when you talk about KPIs for sales or administration or administrative teams, that's HR. Those are not necessarily common areas for those types of metrics. With that said, we do have another short poll. If you can take another 5 or 10 seconds to, the screen should provide you with the questions again. Of course, how much is 5S used in other parts of the organization? And interestingly enough, more of an opinion-based poll, how much can 5S increase margins within non-manufacturing in your organization? Excuse me.
All right, so far we have still have only a few votes, but it's also leaning towards 2 or 3. We have approximately 70% of the answers are a score of 2 to 3. So some, we have 20% none, 36% a little bit, I guess, number 2, and 27% 3. We do have 14% at 4 and 5% very extensive. So still the average towards the somewhat
the lower end.
Lower end, yes.
And is a bit expected, as we mentioned, and even more so given the nature of the responses in the first half of the poll. It seems like we are still, and it's very common, that we are at times still struggling with the implementation or the sustainability of our 5S implementation. So it's difficult when you are still fine-tuning the manufacturing implementation to then use that knowledge in other parts of the business. So that's very much in line with expectation. I am curious of the second question. That would be an interesting of the response to that.
Yeah, you should be seeing that second question on your screen now. How much do you think 5S could add in terms of efficiency and increased margin overall in your organization when applied to non-manufacturing? So really, I think we're split more or less. The average towards 3 to 6%. Interesting to I guess it varies depending on the overall margin and our existing efficiency of your organization, but that's really 54%. Yeah, 3 to 6%.
Well, I think we should put that theory to use or to test. So I believe what we started, excuse me, the growth of 5S thinking is something that, and I see we're short on time or we're running the clock a bit, so I will breeze through this particular slide into the next. Please don't worry, there's nothing that's missed, but I wanted to fast forward to really the meat of the presentation for the sake of time's sake. This was an example of a commercial excellence initiative that I was fortunately enough to be a part of with a chemical product manufacturer. The bottom line is that the business was operating at a $2 million operating losses, and this was the let's say the valley. Previously, it was 3 years of a downward trajectory, and it got to the point where they began to question whether or not the business was profitable. So we went in, myself and a small local team. We had basically our analysis came up with 3 key target areas: increased customer focus, process reviewing, and everyone says they're in customer focus, but when you take feedback from a customer and you're not implementing it into your QMS or into what you're doing, and you're just kind of blaming customers, that's not an increase in customer focus. So feedback was a huge part. Identifying sales and operations misalignments. As in many organizations, you run into areas where sales has one initiative and manufacturing or operations has another, and they're not necessarily aligned. Doesn't mean they have to be in sync, because growth generally pushes us outside of our comfort zone, but we need to definitely modify expectations with sales to the customer and then modify expectations with sales to internal departments. And of course, the end result, the bottom line, was we had to review the product portfolio and analyze pricing structures because there was a $2 million loss. So how did we do this? The first part, and for those who have worked with 5S implementations, you will probably be very familiar with these. What we started gathering through the interview process and the discussions with local management is that we were hearing a lot of the exact same responses that we were hearing to the 5S implementations. Oh, I was trained to look for business. I'm not worried about the other departments, in this case being production. So this is my area, my focus. I'm doing this. The rest I'm less concerned with. Our sales team has always operated in this manner, so why should we change now? Why should I change if we're doing just fine? We actually had people in the organization who thought the business was profitable when it was operating at a $2 million loss. So these are common themes that we started hearing, and again, very similar to the resistance we were getting with 5S implementation. So we had the thought of kind of creating these idea generation workshops, which were a structured approach with different teams. We took some of our lead, let's say, operators, our lead folks from operations who had extensive 5S experience and successful 5S implementation experience. We took myself and the COMEX team, the commercial excellence team, and then we took sales and customer service. And after going through these discussions and looking at some of the potential similarities, we started thinking, is it possible that there could be some solutions or some advancements by using the 5S methodology? What we did was that the 5S, what we refer to as 5S thinking, because now obviously it's not a apples to apples comparison. You're working with a commercial excellence initiative versus a manufacturing floor, but the commonalities were we held a sort of sort, and by sorting, the target margin was a base of 12, a minimum of 12%. So we sorted the customers and the products into 3 separate buckets. Those who were producing a negative margin, those who had a margin that were between 0 and 12%, which is positive but not optimal, and then the 12% plus, which is where obviously the business wanted to be. Interestingly enough, the result was that we discovered 47% of the client base was operating outside of the target margin, which was a bit shocking. But of course, given the operating losses, they had to come from somewhere. We then conducted a bit of a shine exercise, and this is where the accounts in that 47% were then polished off, looked at, reviewed, analyzed, and determined if there was a possibility to get those particular accounts in line with the margin mandate, or whether this was business we no longer needed to be involved in. Obviously, there were some tough decisions made there, but realistically, the last step, that led to positive results. And of course, the last step being the pricing model created to ensure continued profitability. The idea of being able to operate with margins that are less than optimal for a sustained period of time was not going to be part of the future of that business unit. There were some sales relationships and other topics, some very deep level topics, but the end result was that there were customers there were products that were being produced for customers at a loss. So the more they purchased, the bigger and wider the losses were within the business. So once obviously that information was uncovered, we put in a standard to sustain that high level of profitability, and the company continued to grow for 18 months after. These are some of the tangible and intangible benefits. So at the top left, as I mentioned before, product offerings are reduced, labor, raw material cost reductions, all between 5 and 11%. Capacity and revenue increase were between 4 and 6%, which seems small, but if you look at producing products at a loss and taking that capacity and then producing products at a gain, there's kind of a there's a double benefit there. And the end result was actually a 9.5% gain in margin. So 3 to 6 was wishful thinking, or a good target, but the actual end result was 9.5%. And the deliverable that was obviously intangible was the increase in interdepartmental collaboration. So when now in going through that journey, you have a group of employees who are now bonded through taking the organization from a not positive financial position to a more positive position. So these are some of the tools used, right, to increase communication. We had some Gemba boards. We had some tech, again, which seems counterintuitive. The company's losing money, but then they're making investments. They made some small investments, which led to the positive results. I mean, unfortunately, we're not in a world where if you're losing money, it doesn't necessarily mean to get out of that. You just change what you're doing, or you just turn the light switch on. Sometimes you have to, it was challenging, but a little investment and a lot of communication and a strategy with the Comex ops and sales teams, and we delivered 9.5%, which was exceeded expectations, personally speaking. I mean, that was better than we expected. So now, kind of in closing, excuse me, the key takeaways, as we touched on, I believe the poll confirmed, which I'm glad actually, the poll results. We need to master the basics, right? If anything, FIDES is a simple but highly effective tool that can positively change the way we work. So mastering those basics and principles and understanding them and being able to teach them is priceless. Then, of course, once you have that mastery, expanding the FIDES thinking, I assure you, and this is myself included, before I was part of that excellence exercise, that project, if you asked me if we would be able to turn a business around in that setting, I probably would have had my doubts. I've learned never to say never, but highly unlikely is something I'm commonly saying now, and that would have been my thought. But in going through the exercise and in really connecting the dots, we were able to make some impact. So that FIDES thinking, expanding it outward, manufacturing, non-manufacturing, different areas, different industries, I imagine you will be quite surprised And of course, another key point we talk about is finding where to begin, which may sound simplistic, but training, tools, games, mapping, a thorough business diagnostic, all of these different approaches, value stream maps, these can all be used to really pinpoint a good starting point within the organization to make some of these, to look to implement some of these effective tools. It's not to say that you can blindly start anywhere and you won't see results, but the idea is to capture the most low-hanging fruit in as quickly as possible with the optimized results. So selecting a starting point is very, very critical, and it's a point that at times goes a bit under the radar. Just blindly picking an area or picking a department to start looking at is not the most effective way. So hopefully these three things, these three key takeaways are something you can take with you to your organizations after this webinar. In closing, we have the survey questions, and I believe, Jabril, if you can speak to these.
Yes, so once you log out, I believe once we end the webinar, you will receive a window, I think, or receive an email that asks you some of these questions that will help us understand your interests and needs. Thank you, Daniel. Time for questions. We have a first question. Those of you who'd like to ask a question, you can go ahead and type them in the question area on your interface. The first question is, can you provide more details in the COMEX, especially in terms of how did you go about launching and managing a collaboration between the production team and the COMEX team?
Absolutely. Well, first, just one quick point. These survey questions also allow us to plan future value in webinars. So I know it's a bit of a pain at times, but if you can take the time quickly to answer these, it would be a big benefit to us to also provide content and material that is of value to you and anyone else who's listening to the recording. So that would be very much appreciated. To your question, Jabril, unfortunately and fortunately, when organizations, especially with the COMEX, are not doing well, they're very open-minded. And if I could, I would love to take the attitude of a business that is close to the brink of extinction and apply it to a highly profitable, successful business. Simply because what you find is that people are very open-minded. In a normal setting, it probably, as I was speaking, I imagine there were folks listening to the webinar that said, I could never get sales or finance or non-manufacturing or admin or even my manufacturing areas to cooperate with other departments. And that's generally because of the walls that we build in our day-to-day operation. The benefit of having the unfortunate financial circumstances is that we were given the opportunity to think very much out of the box and really apply what we knew in ways and kind of try anything. So that gave us some flexibility to be creative. That gave us flexibility to be able to look at the problem and dissect it in a way that really got to the root cause of what was going on, not just the bickering of, sales blaming production and manufacturing and operations and everyone else kind of pointing the finger at each other. So for starters, that was the first part. The mindset was there and we were given that opportunity. Second part is that as lovely as the slides may seem, this did not happen in a vacuum or overnight. This was a process that took months to go through and to then, of course, validate the results. And I say that because the business was to the point where it was considering, or the powers that be were considering exiting the business. So you're talking about jobs, you're talking about loss. So in their defense, they took everything that they exhausted every possible opportunity to give us a chance to save the business and to really help the site. So an effective approach, open-minded thinking, and enough time. I mean, we didn't have too much time, but we were given enough time in a highly pressurized situation to start to deliver results. We did not go from 0 to 9.5%. We started trickling in and we started seeing areas of improvement, and then we were given the flexibility to continue to build on those concepts. So all of that together is kind of what made Again, it was captured in 2 or 3 slides, but all of that together is what made, what made the COMEX successful.
So a related question, how long did it take and how sustainable was it? Were there immediate short-term results or medium-term results that didn't last, or were they sustainable?
So the total process, and this was just the discovery and diagnostic process with maybe 15% implementation, took 3 months. Fortunately, the 15% implementation started to immediately show results. So in that case, we were given when we talk about 5S, you talk about quick wins. We were given a bit of flexibility, being that we delivered results in a quick manner and that the concepts we developed and the framework that we developed was yielding positive financial benefits. So that gave us a bit of rope in terms of giving us more time to turn the business around. I imagine if that 3-month period did not yield positive results, then maybe the outcome would have been very different. What I do also know is that the 18 months after that 3-month period, the company continued in that trajectory. I then left the organization. So that was kind of the last pulse or last barometer or the reading I had from them. But they had the correct leadership with the correct mindset in place, and they were committed to enhancing the systems that were in place. So I would believe that they would continue down that path. It's a good question, actually. I will follow up just for my own curiosity. But by the time we were finished, they seemed to be in very good shape, and the business had turned around, and everyone seemed to be committed to the cause.
All right. Unless there's another question, it's time to thank you, Daniel, for sharing your experience implementing 5S outside of the core operational area, but in a way that resulted not only in overall improved organization performance, but really that kind of comes back as a benefit also to the operations.